Cryptos, welcome to the Gauntlet. Are you ready?
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for having me on. I'm trying not to be intimidated.
Well, you should be intimidated, actually. Before we get started, let me give the audience a quick reminder about the Lambda Weekend Retreat 2024. This will be the third of the weekend retreats that I've held. And if you're interested in coming, you should email lambda.retreats@gmail.com to book a place. I'm really excited. We're moving to a new place this year. We're going to be in Norfolk, which is probably terrible news for some people who it was right next door to before. But on the other hand, excellent news for some other people for whom it'll be much closer. So it's going to be in Little Walsingham. And it's on the 2nd to the 4th of August, the weekend of the 2nd to 4th of August. So email lambda.retreats@gmail.com, and we'll be doing Bible studies and prayer and also lots of fun and deep discussion, and you don't want to miss that. All right. Let's enter the gauntlet. Round 1. Would you like the topic of music, economics, or cosmology?
Well, I probably shouldn't figure that this will be the easy one, but why don't we go with cosmology?
Ooh, this will be fun. Here are your 3 possible assertions. The universe is fundamentally information. The universe began with a big bang. Or the multiverse violates Occam's razor.
Wow. I'd go with the middle one. I think because that's.
And would you like to argue in favor or against that?
I could probably go both ways, but let's. Right. I'll take a stab at arguing for it.
Great. Do you want to take it away?
Sure. There's a lot of people who would, especially with the sort of progressive nature of evolutionary history, the idea that you begin with a singularity and then from there, sort of random expansion of the universe towards greater and greater. It fills a space, and eventually at some point there's, randomly life occurs and so forth. But we really, in many ways, if you look at it from a Christian or biblical perspective, we're not given enough information to say that this is or isn't the way it happened. Though what we do know is that largely, we could say it came out of nothing, but I think probably more correctly from a biblical perspective, order was brought out of chaos. Right? So there is, I think, the idea that, you could, either it comes from nothing out of the Word of God and it's spoken into existence, and then just it's there, or the speaking of God harnesses chaos and forms it into what we know as ordered matter. Probably, depending on which illustrations and allusions you want to use, there's probably some sense in going both ways. But I tend to think that, the out of nothing idea resonates, that it's just simply the power in the Word of God. There is God, and then He speaks, and then there is creation. And so, what would that look like from a materialistic perspective if you were able to observe this happening? To me, I think that it's not unreasonable to say that, hey, maybe it was a big bang. One of the things I find very, very fascinating about the expansion of the universe notion is, from a biblical creation point of view, that, if you had a strong enough telescope, there is the possibility that you could perhaps reach back and actually see light as it emerges from that moment of creation. Now, the only problem is that once you go back to a certain point, close to that point, it's all basically differentiated radiation at some point. So you really don't actually get to that moment of creation as far as, my knowledge of physics theory goes. But it would be pretty cool to think of that. And so this idea that it comes out and then it sort of pops and then becomes lumpy over, at a certain point, it coalesces and becomes lumpy. To me, I think there's a certain plausibility to that. Now, whether it happens over billions of years or happens in a moment, frankly, nobody really knows. And, the best projections, mathematically or from, projecting from the way things happen right now, it's just merely all conjecture. So, one person's story about how it begins is as good as another person's story how it begins. So to say that God spoke and it came into being and that looked like a big pop or a bang, to me, I think is, that's entirely plausible, and it's as good an explanation maybe as any.
Just to take this in a slightly wacky direction.
Sure.
I've sometimes wondered, so you mentioned, how would that look, the thing that's described in the Bible, if you could kind of look at it scientifically or under a microscope. And I've thought the same thing about things like the feeding of the 5,000, right? If you could grab a microscope and watch the bread and the fish, is there some algorithmic duplication of the biological matter? Is there some kind of highly detailed process that's happening? And
well, let's see, and that's.
Yeah, go on.
I was going to say that is a really interesting point vis-a-vis the miraculous, right? Is that I think it's a mistake oftentimes to want to look for naturalistic explanations or evidence for the miraculous, or how could the flood have happened if we had watched it to try to show the physical processes of how did the flood happen? And there's all kinds of conjectures, but in the end, really, God just willed it into being, right? They willed the flood to happen. And the same in the matter of, the power of God made the bread continue to expand. Just with the widow, the jar never emptied. And what that would look like from a physical process, I'm not convinced that you could, even if you had the right equipment in the moment, penetrate what's actually going on. That then it would, because then it would cease to be miraculous, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I sort of have a similar intuition, I think, in that a miraculous event I'm not sure that it necessarily required God to produce the effect through some bottom-up existing physical process, and in some ways, if there isn't going to be somebody there with a microscope, then perhaps there's just this. I don't know. I guess this is a deep ontological question.
Well, it is, and you can go down a number of rabbit holes with this, right? So as you were talking about it, it gets at some of the foundational presuppositions that we deal with in the post-Enlightenment West. This idea of natural laws, right? So we generally tend to look at, like, even morally and naturally, we tend to look at the order that we see in the world. So the natural order, the physical order, whether it's moral or just merely physical, as something that exists and has its own ontological existence independent of God. Right. So I think it might have been with you that I mentioned this, but I've talked about this before. There's this in philosophy, there's the true sense of higher, like you have Plato's hierarchy of being as a static entity, that being exists and there's a sort of a static architecture. But then you also have Heidegger's understanding that being unfolds on the horizon of time, that there's a constant kind of creative unfolding process, right? And then Gadamer picks this up in terms of that understanding is that thing that happens when you encounter being on the horizon of time, and it becomes real for you, right? So if you look back into, say, something, or look at, say, an idea that is more like Eastern, like the Eastern Orthodox idea of both the being and the energy of God. So there is a sense that in the being of God, there's this kind of idea of the static hierarchy. So you can have that represented in the static hierarchy, but then there's also the energeia, the energy, the outflowing energy of God as represented as this thing that happens on the horizon of time. So you could, in a very mysterious way, sort of in the being of God, wrap up these two realities. So I've always been of the mind that the laws of creation are not separate from God, who is the sustainer of the universe. So in this sense, creation is not something that stopped the moment that God said, "Let there be light," but creation is an ongoing moment by moment process on the horizon of time. And so everything that we see is being unfolded by God moment by moment in its entirety on the horizon of time. So then everything that we talk about as say physical order, what we're really witnessing is the operation of God. So then we're witnessing the constancy of God, his providential sort of this idea that you can count on God at all times to be there. So the order of the universe hangs together because God makes it hangs together. So when God does something that's different, he's not really violating an order that exists separate from his own being. He's merely just doing something different than he ordinarily does. So when I let go of something and it moves from my hand to the ground, you might say that that's God moving it from my hand to my ground. Now we can measure that and call that force gravity, and we can observe it. We can track it or whatever. But really, what we're tracking is, and we're observing, is a physical manifestation of the presence of God. That whole thing of we live in the theater of the glory of God, that it's always unfolding. And so when we're seeing the miraculous, it's not like we're asking God to violate some pre-existing order. We're just merely asking him to act in a way that's different from what he normally does.
Well, I'm afraid we have to, for the sake of time, we have to move on. But it was quite a majestic but brief conversation. So I'm going to...
There we go. Question 2.
A 9. So
very good.
There you go.
I like that.
Off to a stonking start. Ethics, history, or metaphysics?
Well, since we've already done cosmology, let's veer away. Let's do ethics.
The death penalty is unjustifiable. Genetic engineering of humans is ethically wrong. Or abortion is always wrong. 3 quite chunky topics there.
Yeah, they are like the top one's probably the easiest. Let's go with the bottom one, just because it's politically volatile and
and you can't resist.
I can't resist. The other one is almost as volatile, but this one is more so. So I tend to, in this and I've come to appreciate it more and more, is the teleological argument that and even with regards to notions of salvation and so forth, when you look at the wisdom traditions, that our journey reveals the ends with which we have chosen. And so there is a sense that a person is not the sperm, the egg, the whole process are what they will become. So really what you're revealing, in a sense, in the act of conception, what you're revealing is the end, the thing that this person is going to become, and you're beginning to reveal it in this conception process. Now, there's all the arguments that well, 1 in 4 fetuses don't plant themselves into the mother's womb, and there's many that die even after that with miscarriages and so forth. And the reality is that we live in a sinful world, and that sin has disastrous effects. But to take it upon ourselves to interrupt that process is that even though it's just a clump of cells, those clump of cells, they are revealing the person that they're already going to be. So written into the genetic structure, written into the, they're given a unique spirit. So written into all that, there is already a full and complete person there. Now are the egg or the sperm themselves are complete? Now there could be some quibbling there, but I think generally, you really don't want to interrupt the whole process of conception. So doing what you're doing, the idea is that at any point, if you interrupt it, you're stopping a process that leads to a fully formed human being having a life and a fullness of life. And anything that you do intentionally to interrupt that is morally wrong. And so you're robbing a person of their life. And by robbing a person of their life, it is, for lack of better terms, a form of murder. And so that's really kind of the way that I come to it. And that sort of covers, then you really get away from all of like, well, when does a person become a person and blah, 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 blah. It's a person by virtue of that everything is there. It's all complete and it's just waiting to be revealed. The person is already there, complete within its beginning, and it's just simply waiting to be revealed. I guess that's the best answer I can give, which is very traditionally Catholic, Aristotelian, Thomistic in that sense, which I'm comfortable with.
Yeah, so the teleological argument might suggest that any form of contraception would also be an equivalent, right? That just as much as abortion is interrupting
that's right,
the process that choosing to. So
and a lot of people don't want to hear that, but
is the beginning of the process of the new human.
That's right, and a lot of people don't want to hear that, but that is, that's really the case. So, there is, and I forget the passage. There's that one passage where someone refused to give an heir to his brother's wife. Yeah, and would spill his seed, and God's judgment came upon him for that.
Hence the English phrase onanism.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, very good. So there is even like a biblical justification for that. I think, for those that really like to look to a biblical justification and want to get away from, say, the more philosophical, Thomistic, Aristotelian type arguments, that, this idea that you would interrupt this process of giving life to a child is, or to what would become a fully formed person with a complete and full life, is morally wrong. And, the classification that it falls into is into this, it is a form of killing, murder. And it's really hard to escape that conclusion once you go down the rabbit hole. And, and this is why it's one of these things where it's so hard to, can't you just find a compromise on it? And I'm like, well, if I wanted to come and murder 2 of your kids, well, where'd the compromise? Well, we'll just murder 1 and we'll be fine. Yeah. And so, at a certain point in time, it's, and this is, I think, really where, it exposes some of these culture war type of issues that, like the idea of, this, I look at it, is this even really a thing? Right.
The thing that's always been slightly baffling to me about the Catholic teaching, or, the implementation, I guess, of this line of reasoning, is that there is this thing of family planning, which, as I understand it, is the woman is only really going to conceive at certain times in her cycle. So if you sleep together at different times in the month, then you're not going to end up having a child. More likely, you know, if you now this, I think, is pretty commonly practiced and it even encouraged by the Roman Catholic Church, but seems to me to violate the teleological purpose of that part of marriage just as much as other forms of contraception. So do you have do you know why this family planning is distinct?
I'm not like on this aspect of the argument, I'm not like a super expert, but
Sure.
I did read, I think it was a piece recently talking about this notion of family planning as it relates to the idea of lifestyle choice. So it's even the notion that you would plan a family is already a deviation from the core purpose of marriage, to create a context within which children are raised. So even the idea that you would then, that you come in with a sort of almost like a technological plan, and that you then seems to violate the essence of that you're disrupting a process that is natural, part of God's created order, to institute your own plan and to I don't know, violate, but to disrupt that natural order, so as to put in place your own plans for your own life, rather than just simply giving it over to God, giving it over to those natural processes, trusting Him for, in regards to the production of children, but the birth and conception of children. So I think there's a case that could be made that the very idea of family planning is itself, morally suspect.
Well, I'm sorry I dragged you slightly off topic there, but I'm going to give
No, but
you
it's
a
fine.
9
It's all part of
again.
it. Okay, very good. I feel like I'm doing well.
You are. And let's move on to the next round. Cinema and theatre, world affairs, or epistemology?
I'm tempted by world affairs, but let's go with epistemology. I'm kind of curious what the questions might be there.
Reality is subjective. We can never know anything. Or radical skepticism is self-defeating.
Oh man. I think I'm going to do one of the first two, because the third one's kind of obvious. Let's go with the first one, because I think the two, or the first and second, are kind of related, but I think the first one might be more interesting. That reality is subjective. So there is this sense of that, and I'm not an anti-realist in that regard. So there is this thing called reality, that it's quote unquote out there. It's also within me. So reality is there, but how do you relate to reality? So you never are really outside of yourself and your own situation in terms of how you deal with reality. So your perception of reality, your understanding of reality, is always subjective. It's always related to you as the knowing subject. So even pre-consciously, your mind filters out, your consciousness filters out various bits of reality. So you start with sort of raw reality, and your sensory apparatus, prior to you even being aware of sense data coming in, is already pre-consciously filtering out the sense data. So you never end up with a full picture of the world. It's always only partial. And then our brains are also designed to tune out much of the reality other than the stuff that we're actually focusing on. Because if we did, and those that can't filter it out, they eventually go mad. It's a form of mental illness. The inability to filter out sense data. So people always talk about this idea, well, just give me the facts. Well, there is really no such thing as a fact. We choose to focus in on certain aspects of reality. And then we take that sense data in and we apprehend it. But there's been all these choices, like why focus on this? Why not focus on that? Some of these choices are made pre-consciously. Some of them are made consciously. So you as an observer never encounter reality other than through your own subjective choices, either made subconsciously, pre-consciously, or consciously. So there's never sort of a reality that's just out there, confronted outside of yourself objectively. So you're always there as a subjective knower, which means that even though reality is out there, there is no objective apprehension of a reality. There is no, like, reality itself does not create a fixed point for knowledge. Let's put it that way.
How about the Cartesian idea of the self as an immovable and undeniable reality, like that I exist, even if all the other things are illusory?
Like, I exist because I am thinking, that I'm conscious of myself.
Yes, that even though all of the things you describe, all the processing that happens before you make an observation mean that there's, and you're reliant on sense data from potentially untrustworthy organs.
Yeah, but even
there's
still
a root I, yeah.
Yeah, you begin with the idea, you understand that reality is there, that you have to simply accept the fact that either your senses are completely lying to you, which I suppose is a possibility, the whole matrix question, right? And that your senses are lying to you, or you trust your senses that reality is actually what it is. It's real. But even your own thought, I am thinking about my thoughts, is never made. It's not an objective thought. Even that is itself is a subjective realization, because it's you as a knowing subject making that realization about yourself as a knowing subject. So there's no real anchor in that regard. And that's really the problem with the Cartesian notion of knowledge, is that it wants to anchor knowledge in subjective rationality. So then you move out from there so then you move out from that subjective rationality to say that this rationality becomes the objective anchoring, which then forms the foundation for knowledge, which is just simply not the case. And this is why we end up in the moral situation. This is what Alistair McIntyre detailed in his book about morality, because in the end, what happens is that that this subjective or this thing that we call objective reality, or this rationality that we have that is supposed to be objective, supposed to be the anchor that provides us with sure knowledge, just ends up devolving into how do I feel about things? Does it feel good to me, or does it not feel good to me? So in the end, there really is, reality is out there. It turns out that knowledge is fraught, but there is nothing upon which to anchor ourselves. And this is other than the sense of our, how do you put it? Our apprehension of the divine. But even then, it's a knowing subject apprehending the divine. So really what it does is it lends a sense of humility to our knowledge. So I can make truth claims, I can assert knowledge, but I really there's nothing outside of myself to ground it, which is, I always come back to that in the end, it all comes back to the person, that you simply have to accept the fact that, is this person a wise person? Is this person an intelligent person? Does this person see rightly? And if this person sees rightly, perhaps their judgments about reality can be trusted. And really what we've done in the whole process of scientism and so forth, of trying to anchor truth in reality outside of ourselves, is that we've denied the subjectivity of all knowing, and we end up in a crisis of authority, because the reality itself, objective reality, what was so-called objective reality, we can observe it, we can measure it, and so forth, but it still can't answer the question of what should I do? So eventually you have, or what does it all mean? And so at a certain point in time, somebody exercises a judgment and says, well, this is what it is. Now it flows out of his subjective reality, or this is what we should do, or this is what it means. And we recognize that there is a certain humility to that you never can be sure 100% that this judgment is true, that this apprehension of reality is correct. And it is this humility that I think pervades. You sense this much more as you read the ancient texts like the scriptures, that you can talk about things like truth, but to me, honestly, this is one of the things that got the West off the rails, was this pursuit of truth over wisdom. And so you can make wise judgments, but truth is a thing in theory, I suppose, like the forms, the metaphysics, the divine presence, it's out there. We assert that it's there, but our apprehension of it is always ever only partial and subjective. And so,
wonder,
yeah,
when we make this distinction between wisdom and truth, which is, of course, a very natural dichotomy for, I'm sure any of the listeners will immediately think in those terms, but is it actually the case, say for example you said I don't know, do you want to get the lid off a jar?
Yeah,
you want a man for that. Right? That
you
would be
do
like, that
generally
would be wisdom. Now you might say that the statement, men are statistically X% more likely to have higher grip strength, and therefore you've got a better chance of getting the lid off if you that you could say, well, that's more true because the quote unquote wise statement is actually an oversimplification. But I'm just not sure I'd buy that this kind of almost autistic framing where you have to lay out everything like a computer program. And
even so, as some a mutual online has said, William Briggs, that probability, there is no such thing as probability, right?
It is its own abstraction.
Yes, exactly. And so the fact that something has happened 3 million times in the past, you still can't guarantee that it's not going to be different the next time. And just because you've shown that something doesn't happen 1 million times doesn't therefore falsify the fact that it could happen again the next time. Right? So there is all of these problems with the notion of probability and so forth. It gives you the appearance that you know something, and maybe you do. And there is something like, a lot of wisdom literature is based upon observation, right? So that's part of the whole wisdom process, is that you learn to see with divinely instructed eyes, and then you see the world rightly. And in so seeing the world rightly, you then can make judgments in the moment as to what to do. But in seeing the world rightly, someone could say, well, that's almost like science. And in a certain sense, yeah, it is. Somebody can, part of maybe making really good or doing really good seeing is to take some measurements and make some notes and to test that knowledge over time with some experiments. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you've arrived at anything, that you have what's called objective truth. So you have the fact that you chose to study this thing, the fact that you chose to study it in this manner, that you've limited your terms of observation, all of these things then create a reduction of reality and, a partial map of what is really there. And it might be a very useful map. And this is the thing about, scientific learning. It's very, very powerful because it's useful for harnessing natural resources, people, the physical world, towards social organization, the making of money, creating very powerful machines. So these observations can be very, very powerful. That doesn't necessarily, we shouldn't then say that they give us sure truth. They give us something that is proximate and something that's good enough to build powerful machines, but it still doesn't give us objective truth.
Well, we've gone slightly over on time, but I thought your answer was superlative here, so I'm going to give you 12.
Well, there we go. I felt like I was, this is almost like my oral exams in seminary where I felt like I was stumbling the whole time, but that's the best one we heard all year. And I'm like, okay, if I felt like I was dying in there, I don't know how the guys who felt. Maybe they didn't know they were failing.
I've seen studies where people who do well in exams always leave feeling like they've done badly, and the people who do badly in exams always leave feeling like they've done well. And I think the reason is because the people who do well on the exams are fully aware of all of the places that they struggled, and the people who didn't do well, they did the best they could have hoped for. So they're sort of happy with the fact that some of the stuff they got asked, they actually had something to say,
That's right. Okay, so we have 3 more.
Psychology, elite theory, and theology. Well, there's 6 rounds, and this is round 4. So
let's go with elite theory. The other 2 almost seem too easy. Oh, yeah.
Populism is a delusion. Libertarians are as utopian as socialists, or elite rule is an inevitable feature of organized society.
Let's go with the middle one because it's been dump on Libertarians Week this week on Twitter. So let's, I mean, it's always dump on Libertarians Week on Twitter, but yeah, libertarian. You can't be a libertarian without being a utopian. The thing about the libertarian is the socialist or the communist is looking to sweep away present reality and in so doing usher in, the utopian future, or maybe the more progressive model that we will, through the application of technique, gradually build and perfect society. Right? And eventually we will reach that tipping point where the world will be perfect. Now, the libertarian, on the other hand, basically asserts that if you remove all of the shackles from people, that what will emerge is, a proper, rightly ordered society, because, the tyranny of laws and regulations and rules imposed upon people, once they're taken away, will allow them just to be the best selves that they can be. Now, I'm not being kind to libertarianism because libertarianism makes a number of assumptions that the basic goodness of all people. So in this sense, libertarianism is really just, and they won't like to hear this, but really libertarian is just a variation on, liberal utopianism, which is a variation on socialism, which is a variation on communism. Or Rousseauian liberalism, this idea that we are a blank slate and that all the problems are out there in society. And that if we can just engineer society properly or take away all the things and get all the rules right, then these blank slates will just simply emerge into a properly well-ordered society. And as long as that assumption is correct, perhaps it might be the case. But there's a lot of evidence to indicate that that assumption is false, and that the only reason why anyone might perceive that libertarianism might work is that there's already a well-functioning moral society to begin with. And if you just allow the people within a moral, well-functioning society to kind of go about their business and being moral and well-functioning, that it will be a moral, well-functioning society. But they really discount the fact that all the rules have been ingrained through usually a tight-knit social order, a religious structure. It's been imposed, it's been cultivated. Nobody just wakes up and is fully moral. And that's really, I think, this is why libertarians they're not conservative. They're fundamentally leftists. There is no such thing as a conservative libertarian. And the fact that anyone's invited them into a conservative movement is just baffling on my mind, because all libertarians are basically liberals, because they work from that fundamental frame that I think really divides in the modern era between the conservative, the true conservative, and the liberal, is your understanding about the basic state of man. So if mankind is born good or a blank slate, if that is the way you think, that all people are basically good, then you are a liberal. And if you think that all people are born flawed and corrupted, and that this is a problem that needs to be managed in some form or another, or dealt with, then you are some manner potentially of conservative. Now, you can have some who end up sort of veering into kind of a state utopianism that we can fix it ourselves. But that's a sort of a different story. But I think one of the fundamental, divides in that regard is between what do you believe is the basic condition of mankind, and a libertarian understands the basic condition of mankind as being basically good. So then the idea is that, hey, if we get rid of the current order, which is more or less what the Marxists and the socialists will try to tell you, then people will emerge naturally into their better selves once all the shackles of government and government regulation have been taken off them.
I suppose
so yeah, it's utopian.
The distinction that I see between libertarians and socialists is that the socialists are keen on redistribution of wealth and trying to create equality, whereas libertarians have no concern about inequality whatsoever.
That's right.
And
so
to a degree, the libertarians might say that they are not assuming the fundamental goodness of man, and the from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, does assume the fundamental goodness, because that would imply that you get no reward for working hard, whereas in fact you need to do whatever you can to incentivize people to work hard because of their natural slothfully nature.
Well, here's perhaps a different way to look at it, is that they're both looking to arrive, in my mind, at the same end state, which is a utopian society that they engineer. The one method of engineering is through active management of society, redistribution, rules, the expert engineering the better future. Whereas the other says that no, this same utopia that we're striving for can only be achieved if we stop engineering society and just unleash people and just let them go. So on the one hand, like you're looking to say, like, we have this idea. Now it's indistinct. Nobody really knows what it looks like because nobody sees it, this utopian ideal. And the one is saying that we need to engineer life to get to that point. And the other says, no, we need to do the exact opposite. We need to stop like all attempts at engineering and just let people loose, and they will arrive there themselves. And so really, in that regard, I think that you have more or less what you might call competing factions within a post-enlightenment utopian vision for the future. That once you toss away Christianity, that you generally are looking at, sort of the goal becomes, well, things are wrong with the world. We want them all fixed. There is this ideal state that we sense could be possible. So how do we get there? And it's incumbent upon us as human beings to create the condition for our own utopia in this life, because all that religious nonsense is just, BS anyways, right? So, and that's kind of where you get all of these different strains of how you end up at the utopian state.
Great. Well, I'm going to give you 11 for that round, I think.
Very nice.
Which moves us on to round 5. Technology, natural sciences, or Christology?
I'm going to take the easy route. Maybe that'll dock me points because I won't go for like the difficulty score, but I'm going to go with technology.
Sure. Virtual reality will pacify the oppressed masses. The internet has made the truth more accessible. Automation will have a net positive impact.
Let's go with the middle one. The internet has made truth more accessible. I think that the exact opposite is the case. That, again, the more information that you have, and the more information that you have available to you, the less likely it is that you are to arrive at true insights about the universe. So this is something that Ellul talks about all the time, and especially in his book In Propaganda. So one of the ways that you control people and prevent them from reaching the truth is to bombard them with information all the time. So they're confronted with news, they're confronted with media, they're confronted with images. And eventually at a certain point, we talked about in one of the previous things that your brain has to be able to sort of shut things out and sort them off. But when all this information is coming at you all the time, it becomes very, very difficult to sort out what's valuable, what's not valuable, what's important, what's not important. And eventually what happens is your brain will look for relief from the onslaught of information. And so you will begin to turn to the person who tells you what it means. And the person who's most desirous to tell you what it means is the propagandist. And so now the propagandist has you. So the propagandist keeps you always floating on a constant stream of new information daily. This is why, like for me too, like myself personally, even though I comment on Twitter constantly, I don't really pay a lot of attention to the news. I try to avoid the news, and I don't spend a lot of time these days even on the timeline because too much information just overwhelms you and you can't think. So a lot of times the thing that you want to do if you want to recover your own thoughts is actually to reduce the amount of data that's coming in to still your mind. So the quiet cell. And once you are away from this constant stream of internet information, your mind begins to open up again to not just your own thoughts, but just thinking in general. And so really what happens with the internet and the constant barrage of thoughts and the constant barrage of information is that you stop thinking and you just feel the information more than you think. So this is why we see this all the time, that people and truth become, what becomes the latest thing is always mimetic, and people reacting to how they feel about different stories. So you can manipulate people's feelings very easily. And so people's feelings are manipulated mimetically by the propagandist, and they float from moment to moment on this constant barrage of information, and they have no thoughts other than the ones that are given to them within this propagandistic web of information. So as information increases, the amount of information that you take in, the amount of real thinking that you do about it actually decreases. And thus truth becomes less accessible. So that the more information you have, the less able you are to apprehend the truth.
I'll tell you one reason that the internet has made it easier to find the truth is because you can subscribe to Lambda Bible studies on YouTube, and therefore you will get dropped in your inbox every week some pure fact pills, some based Bible knowledge that has absolutely no false information in it whatsoever.
Well, and that
no, you're describing the problem with there being too much information, but is it not our own fault for exposing ourselves to the fire hose? You mentioned trying to avoid going to the news source, and not spending too much time on the timeline of Twitter.
And really, I mean, part of it is people say, wow, you're on Twitter, you know what you're doing. Yeah, I do. So, in the sense, it's grabbing the ring of power, knowing that it's corrupting you. But I see, if I didn't see a real purpose, and even figures like Orrin McIntyre, well, so forth, like he'll say quite openly, like, we're doing propaganda here, folks. We're trying to instill maybe the truth into you, but we're doing so propagandistically. We're trying to shape you, right? We're trying to shape the narrative by which you understand the world. And so that's really what we're getting. That's why I do it. And it says, because I believe that there's a point to trying to shape people propagandistically, but you can do no other with the tools that were at hand. So if you want to sort of step away from this, and this is really sort of the disaster of sort of the deracination, the breaking down of community, the massifying of society, is that community used to form a kind of buffer to the wider world. Now, yes, your information was limited, but there was often in these small communities that there were things that people understood better, even though the perceptions of the world were narrower. They were just confined to their little village life or their neighborhood and the community. So even though their life was narrower and the amount of information they took in was narrower, they in many ways had a greater confidence about their actions, about who they are as people. They had a greater sense of psychic peace. And their thoughts were generally more their own. It seems counterintuitive to live in a smothering, tight-knit community that's very, that has a religious base that tells you, where you're going to work, who your friends are going to be, where you're going to worship, where you're going to eat lunch on Sunday, who you're going to marry, all of these things. And you think, oh, I'm just being smothered by this community. But the truth be told, your thoughts were probably more your own in that community, because you were there before, once the propaganda came in, you were buffered from that. And this is what we see in, say, something like COVID. Who were the places that were most likely to resist the diktats from the state? It was small church communities. And it wasn't because they were narrow-minded or backwards. It's because the tight-knit nature of the community allowed them to resist the propaganda that they were being fed. So for them, their tight-knit nature of their community, you may look at it as narrow-minded, you might look at it as small and so forth, but they were able to see a truth that many were not, and were able to apprehend it and act on it, and to say that, no, we don't need to follow the propaganda, we can act differently. And then they're able to do this largely because of the insulation that the community provides from the propaganda. Even today, that there's still some buffer left in small, tight-knit communities.
It strikes me that the internet has meant that I personally have understood reality and truth better, but most people have ended up understanding reality and truth worse. So the sort of net result for humanity is a less accurate view of the world, even though I am part of a small subset of people for whom the internet has actually improved their understanding of the world.
Well, and this is I don't know how familiar you are with the theory of genetic bottlenecks, right? So they're talking about how, certain points in history create genetic bottlenecks, and those that are able to thrive in that genetic bottleneck, they succeed and their genes get passed on. And there's something to this, right? So what they're arguing now is that the new genetic bottleneck is those who are able to be confronted with, as you say, the fire hose of information and are able to retain their own thoughts are those who will survive to pass their genes on to become the next sort of leadership class in our society. They will become like I don't know what the right word is, like the alphas in society is those that can actually distinguish themselves from the mimetic world that being immersed in this constant fire hose of information creates. So if you get subsumed by it, you're going to get lost. But for those that can manage to hold on to their own thoughts, they create something of a new kind of genetic elite that then, it's both genetic, but then they pass those traits on through teaching or whatever through their children. And these become sort of the quote unquote, the survivors in this new genetic bottleneck that the information era creates.
Well, that's a very optimistic take.
It is. Well, considering, because I tend to think of myself as somewhat immune to the propaganda. So then, it's always nice to conceive of your self-image of like, I'm one of the survivors who's right, passing on through this, right? So, I'll admit to a little bit of self-aggrandisement in some of these things, right? So I can cop that.
I've got to give you another 12 because
thank you.
Was another masterful take, and it brings us on to our last round. Literature, software and mathematics, or eschatology?
Let's go with eschatology. That sounds like fun.
All right. Christians will be taken up to heaven before the tribulation. The Antichrist is a specific individual, or Jesus will return after the millennium.
Let's go with the middle one, I think. And this
Antichrist is a specific individual.
Yes. I think good arguments could be made that, the Antichrist is a symbol for a larger movement, like a series of a style of behaving or acting, a certain character to a movement or whatever sort of evidences the spirit of Antichrist. There's something to that, but over time I have become far more acknowledging of the notion that we are in the middle of a real spiritual battle, and that we psychologize demonic entities at our own peril. So there is a real Satan, a real devil, and there are real demons. And once you begin to acknowledge that the evil one is real and that there are real demons, it is not hard then to say that at some point, when we do not know, that it is quite probable, quite possible, and the scriptures seem to indicate that, a singular figure will arise. Now, have we seen this figure? No. One of my seminary profs said, if you're wondering whether the end times are happening, that's probably a good sign that they're not. He says, when the end times happen, you will know when Jesus returns. Let's put it that way.
Not like the first time when it was sort of slightly subtle.
You will know. So there is this sense that when the last days truly, really are upon us, you will know. Now, that being said, so that means that, I think that there is a real possibility that the Antichrist is a real person. Now, that being said, we talked about before how the flow of events are typological, and they're also teleological. So if at the end there is this final revelation of Antichrist in a particular person, that prior to that, you might say that the spirit of Antichrist and who this being will be revealed prior to that. So I believe that sort of, in a sense, what the Antichrist is going to become in that final day is being revealed in the archetype of the Antichrist as it moves forward. Just in the same way, it comes down to this passage in Luke, the Tower of Siloam, where these people any more wicked than any others, right? And you could say that this tower falling on the people is a revelation of the archetype of judgment falling upon humanity. Now, are they being judged for any specific sins versus the general sinfulness of humanity? Jesus seemed to indicate that it's just basically, this is the kind of things that happen to sinful humanity who lay under judgment, that the archetype of judgment will bubble up, will reveal itself, will break through from time to time as we approach those end days. And so when you see the archetype of judgment, when you see the archetype of the Antichrist revealing itself, these are all warning signs for you to get ready. So what does Jesus say in that passage? He said, well, in Luke, I think it's Luke 13, that you had better, basically the thing is, you'd better get right with God while you still have a chance. That your time to repent is upon you and it's drawing short. And so when you see the archetype of the Antichrist being revealed, this is your indication to sort of not slack off, but maintain your watchfulness, your Gregorios, to be the watcher, in the like those parables in the Olivet Discourse, to keep watch, because you don't know the day or the hour. So don't be the one that's going off to get, oil for your lamps. That type of thing is, be prepared, because you don't know when that day and hour's coming, because you're seeing the archetype of the Antichrist being revealed. Know that sooner or later, the Antichrist will be revealed in his fullness. So that would be my answer. I'm not hearing you, Lou. Or I think you're muted.
Oh, apologies. So I am.
No worries. I could see your mouth moving, and then.
Yes, I was just saying, very strong final round. I'm giving you 10, and now if I programmed this wonderful visualization, but it still has a couple of flaws. Like, I have to manually refresh the
there we go.
high score table to see you on it. But look, yeah, you are third place from quite a long and distinguished list of competitors.
Yeah. You can go ahead and email Black Horse, right? And just let him know how that worked out. He'll love that.
3 points higher than
yeah, I'll tell him to watch, and then he can complain to you later.
We'd hate to spoil the surprise.
He did well.
Well, thanks again for joining me.
I'm going to have to go back and listen to that Morgoth episode, because that's got to be an all-timer.
Oh, well, he's top of the leaderboard, so
there we go,
with that. All right. Thanks everybody, and I guess join us tomorrow. I'll have another guest on. if I stick to the release schedule I have planned.
There we go.
Makes this whole communication thing slightly awkward. Earlier in the stream, I was going to say, oh, I have a relevant stream that I'm doing tomorrow on Lambda Bible Studies. But of course, by the time this is aired, it will have already happened several weeks in the past. So it's all very confusing.
You're time traveling to do Bible studies.
I literally am, yes, I'm experiencing all the same complexities as Back to the Future.
Yeah. Well, and we could have argued, like why the past isn't a thing, but that would be,
yes,
so we didn't get a chance to talk time travel. That would have been fun.
Now, I think that might exist in one of the rounds. There's so many fascinating questions.
I can imagine. It was a good, really well done though, by the way, Luke. It was a lot of fun.
Good. All right. Well, let's close it out.